This is Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.
I shudder thinking how the world can be so cruel. I lend my voice to those who can't. It's time we try, it's time we care, it's time we stand. It starts with a voice.
Welcome to the Special Chronicles podcast. My name is Daniel Smukowski. I'm the founder and host of Special Chronicles, our website, specialchronicles.com, where you can stream our archives and follow Special Chronicles on socials and wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Special Chronicles podcast, Spread the Word Day of Activation was earlier this month on March 5th. We think the world would be better if everyone were included. Around the world, exclusion and discrimination continue to divide people with and without intellectual and developmental disabilities. We're changing that with grassroots action for inclusion. This year, you can engage and activate in multiple ways by choosing your focus, derogatory language, bullying, or inclusive action. To help you understand why the Spread the Word campaign is important, we are rebroadcasting a few episodes this month that will highlight the importance of why you should join us in the Spread the Word campaign. Visit spreadtheword.global to access resources and sign the pledge and grab your official gear. Together, let's create a more inclusive world. This week, our focus is on inclusive action, and we bring you a rebroadcast conversation with Dr. Jackie Jurdo, Chief Global Youth and Education Officer at Special Olympics, to talk about inclusive mindsets. The following episode has been previously broadcasted. This week on the Special Chronicles podcast, we are welcoming a returning guest to the program, Dr. Jackie Jurdo, Chief of Global Youth and Education at Special Olympics International. So please put your virtual hands together as we welcome Dr. Jackie to back to the Special Chronicles show. Welcome back, Jackie.
Thank you so much. Daniel, it is so great to be back, and I'm glad that I'm on episode 521.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you today.
Awesome. Yeah, it's exciting. And so long-time listeners will remember, and I'll try to remember to put a link to the last episode that you were on. But if our listeners just go to specialchronicles.com, click on podcasts, and then click on Spread the Word series, they can find that last episode that you were on. Because hundreds of episodes, I can't keep track of what number and what guest each guest was on. Yeah, I think not a lot of people, as our chairman Tim Shivo says, not a lot of people get to return on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm honored. I'm honored as a returning guest. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know Tim has been a returning guest as well, and so for our new listeners, why don't you kind of reintroduce yourself to our listeners and your connection to our Special Olympics movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jackie Jodel, and I oversee the global education work for Special Olympics International. And so that means that I focus on really three areas. The first area is all of the work that we have going on in schools. The second area is I get to work on youth leadership, which is one of my favorite areas. And the last area that I get to work on is supporting the Global Center for Inclusion and Education. It's based in Abu Dhabi, and it's one of the legacies that came out of our 2019 World Games in Abu Dhabi. And we're really focused on building a range of thought leadership efforts to drive inclusion and education across the world.
Awesome. I know I also attended the 2019 World Games in Abu Dhabi as a SSIGM, and it's amazing. I'm glad that we're having you on this episode to talk about inclusive mindsets, because I think, and I've talked with some of my other SSIGM colleagues about the legacy from those World Games, about how that region refers to us as people with determination. And I think that language, which we'll talk about during the course of this episode about inclusive mindsets, but that language, and maybe even before we introduce the topic, I don't know if you want to kind of comment on, like, one of the legacies from the Abu Dhabi World Games is their language of meet the determined, of people with determination, and kind of how that.
Yeah, absolutely. Language is so important when you talk about bridging differences and respecting that language can be used to divide, or language can be used to bridge and include. And so one of the things that came out of the World Games in the United Arab Emirates, was based in Abu Dhabi, was the country did a couple of really interesting things. The first thing is that they use this wonderful phrase to describe those with intellectual disabilities, and that is people of determination. And it really speaks to the inner core of those with ID short for intellectual disabilities. And it really speaks to, what's really driving those with ID in approaching their lives. And that is just a heck of a lot of determination in order to, be different in a society that isn't always accepting and tolerant of difference. And the other thing that happened with the UAE and the games in Abu Dhabi is the government made the decision to make all of the government schools in the United Arab Emirates inclusive. So children with and without ID are in the same schools. And so depending on where you're listening in from, this may be something that's very typical to your education system. But in most parts of the world, it's not. In most parts of the world, children are educated separately. And actually, in many parts of the world, children with intellectual differences are not being educated. Which is a topic for another episode. But that's that's the big backdrop to this conversation today, which I'm really excited about when we start talking about inclusive mindsets.
Awesome. Awesome. I know hearing how they changed their language, how the UAE changed their language to people with determination. For myself with ID and my fellow athletes around the globe, knowing that there's a region in the world that is leading the way in having mindsets changed about us. It means a lot, because, like, I know growing up, without giving my age away too much, but I'll just say, more than 30 years ago, when I was born, it was different than what it is today. And so it's let's not kind of lead that into the topic for this episode on inclusive mindsets. And in our pre-show meeting, you told me about a conversation that you had with our chairman, Tim Shriver. Hopefully Tim will tune into this episode. But Tim had noticed, you had told me that Tim had noticed pattern outcomes of individuals without intellectual disabilities being involved in our Special Olympics programs. So can you tell us briefly about this conversation that you had with Tim, as what I believe is, and I'm sure you will probably agree, is the catalyst for Unified Champion Schools?
Yeah, so one of the most important conversations I had with Dr. Shriver, our chairman, when I assumed my role leading the global education work at Special Olympics, was he said, for the last 40 years, I have been watching how our programming, how the experience of Special Olympics impacts the mindsets of its participants. And just to remind our listeners, Most of our programming is what we called a unified model, meaning we bring together those with and without ID, right? And by bringing people, young people, adults together, children together, with those differences, what he was seeing is these patterns across these experiences that were resulting in mindsets or different points of views being developed over time, where all of a sudden, people started focusing on not the differences, but that those really started to melt away. But they started focusing on was the similarities. And in the case when you just specifically look at youth, he started seeing these mindsets being developed where our youth that had been through these shared experiences, Special Olympics, started it just became like second nature, where they're welcoming to others within their peer group that may have differences, but they just seem to be very comfortable with those differences and just reached out across those differences and started to include and to embrace and really started to create a change in the school environment, like a ripple effect, where all of a sudden inclusion became actually a norm in the learning environment of schools. And I'm an educator, or I have been an educator in my life. And one of the most important things that any student or any parent or any caregiver or any teacher knows is that if you want young people to learn, you have to create an environment that's safe. And safety in a learning setting is where all the kids feel included and they all feel valued for their contributions. And that's exactly what Tim was focusing on when he was as an observer. And he is, he is the movement's greatest educator. And he started to see that these mindsets being developed in the work. And he started saying, okay, what happens, Jackie, if we can really start to really drill in and define it exactly in terms of its core components, and then really determine a framework that would help us make it teachable. And so we would start to create, a mass effect where it's not just those who go through the Special Olympics shared experiences, but we're starting to bring it into schools. So it's part of what we do to create a community and culture and learning settings, and for that matter, any other settings.
Awesome. Well, that moves us into you shared with me, I guess, an early early sneak peek of what is by the time this episode airs, it was recently released, is a brief that you co-authored with Tim and with Tim along with Stephanie Jones, a professor in child development and education and director of the ESO lab at Harvard. Yeah, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, along with our chairman, Dr. Tim Shriver. And so can you kind of give us an overview of that brief and kind of highlight the vision for understanding inclusion, which, as I'm sure many of our listeners, some of our listeners might know, but for decades, Special Olympics has cultivated a theory and practice of inclusion that celebrates differences and harnesses individual and collective strengths to foster learning settings that are characterized by acceptance, understanding, and appreciation of others, and that Special Olympics that our view is simple, that if we teach children to play together, they can learn, grow, and ultimately thrive together. And so I guess kind of give us an overview of this brief and define inclusion, and also what's a mindset. Can you give us a brief overview of what the whole content, yes. A brief overview of what this brief is, as we define inclusion and define what's a mindset.
Absolutely. So the first thing when Dr. Shriver came to me and said, this is what I've been seeing with my 40 years of experience from a very young age. He got involved with Special Olympics when his mother, the founder of Special Olympics, brought him in to help support work and just really make sure that his own development was shaped by being in environments that were truly inclusive. And so he said, let's drill in and take a look at what's really going on here. And so what we did is we reached out to a colleague of ours, Dr. Stephanie Jones at Harvard, who is a global authority on the development of children, and in particular, the social emotional development of children. And we said to her, okay, the view of Special Olympics, like you just said, Daniel, is simple. We know that if we can teach children to play together, they're going to be able to learn together, they're going to be able to grow and develop together, and they're ultimately, as adults, they're going to thrive together. And so we brought that vision to her, and she said, all right, let's develop a research project on inclusive mindsets, but let's first start that project by defining inclusion. And it's very interesting because across the world, everyone throws around the word inclusion, but nobody really knows what it means. And so we knew that we needed to really nail down that definition of inclusion. Because again, when you're talking about using language to build relationships, to build bridges across difference, language is so important. And so we defined inclusion. And we define it very simply as, a practice or policy of providing equal access to those who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized. That's what it is, equal access. And it could be those with physical or mental differences, and it could be those, members of minority groups, racial, ethnic differences. It could be across gender. So it's just really providing, equal opportunity, equal access to opportunities and resources. Go ahead.
No. Awesome. Go
Yeah.
Go
and
ahead.
then we knew that inclusion in practice, that's the definition, but in practice, like what does it look like? And what you see, like if you shut your eyes and imagine an environment that you've been in where it's inclusive, you see that there's an awareness of difference, but at the same time, there's an acceptance of difference, and there's an understanding of the different perspectives and experience of those who are different from ourselves. And that's what it looks like, or what it feels like in practice. So that's where we started. And what Dr. Jones did, along with a group of us at Special Olympics, there were over 30 of us on a work group, we started this research project, and it was a journey. And while she was the research expert, we were the sounding board, the stakeholders, and she would report back to us periodically, once a quarter, to help shape the research project in ways that we knew was true to Special Olympics. So what she did is she developed a conceptual framework, tested in several different sites, both in the United States as well as other global sites, with an understanding of, okay, our theory here is that our work is building mindsets. Our work is, and a mindset, and its simplest definition is just a set of beliefs that really make sense of how we think about the world and ourselves. It's a set of beliefs, like how we approach the world. And it's so important because our values and our beliefs affect everything that we do, or we feel, or we think, or we experience. And it also affects our perceptions of others and how we move through the world. So one's mindset is absolutely essential. And what was so important about our work is that we know, and this is what the brain science tells us, this is what the learning science tells us, we know that mindsets are malleable, meaning they can be shaped, and they can be developed. This is such an important thing, because many people believe that some people are just inherently empathetic or just inherently accepting of difference. But actually, you have to build that mindset in people, and you build it. You can be very deliberate about how you build it. You build it by creating knowledge about difference. You build it by creating some very specific skills, which this research project uncovered. And then you have to create experiences for us to practice those skills and to exercise our values. So that's what I'm going to talk about as we get into this framework and explain it to our listeners.
Awesome. And I guess to wrap up this first segment, can you give us a brief overview of the core concepts of the pillars of this framework? We're going to share, for those of you just listen to the audio podcast, we're going to share an image of what these pillars are on the screen. So if you just listen to the audio podcast, go watch the full video episode on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn. You can find links on specialchronicles.com to watch the full video episode. And so, Jackie, do you want to give us kind of a brief overview of?
Absolutely. So what the research uncovered is there are 3 essential pillars of an inclusive mindset. 3 essential pillars. The first one is the notion of universal dignity. And what universal dignity is, it's a core value that really is an appreciation for human dignity, regardless of difference. That all people, regardless of the differences that we may perceive that they have, is recognized as being valued and being worthy. And so universal dignity, it falls in what we typically in the field of, development, psychology and development is thinking of as a value or a belief. But it's really, in terms of the conceptual framework, it's the foundational piece of this framework. The second piece, the second pillar, shifts into what we know and what we're able to do. And these are really skills. And this is the ability to empathize with others as well as take the perspective of another. So empathy is very simple, just being able to understand how someone else feels and to be able to respect and appreciate how another person feels. And then not only another person, but also yourself, to be able to understand how you're feeling, what your perspectives are in a situation, when you're interacting with others. And then the third pillar is what we call courageous action. And this is absolutely essential. And this is why if Stephanie Jones was here with us today, she would say that the framework is inclusive mindsets and behaviors. Because what courageous action does is it takes the value of human dignity and appreciation for all humanity, regardless of difference, and it takes those skills of empathy and perspective taking, which is understanding your own emotions and views, as well as the emotions and views of another. And it allows you to walk the talk. It allows you, with courageous action, to have the values and the skills that you need to stand up for someone who may be marginalized. Even though it's going to be uncomfortable, potentially uncomfortable to do so in whatever your environment is. But it's that willingness to speak up and to act when something's wrong or something harmful happens, despite the potential cost to oneself. So it's acting outside of one's comfort zone and looking out for others. So those really were the 3 pillars of, if you want to look at those out there and think about yourselves, listeners, if you have an inclusive mindset, if you can really see those 3 pillars in the way that you approach the world and your relationships, in the relationships in your lives.
Awesome. Well, we're going to dive into these three pillows doing the final three segments of this episode. And we all, I think, this introduction went a little bit long, so we might have to kind of condense these pillows a little bit to kind of reach, so we try not to go over the 1 hour mark on these episodes, because I'm sure all of you listening are busy. But if you're listening and you are commuting to work or around the house or running or walking or whatever, then I'm sure you guys will enjoy this conversation. Our guest is Dr. Jackie Jodo, and we'll dive into more of the overview of these three pillows, and as a roadmap, as you said, Jackie, as a roadmap for all of our Special Olympics programming to use in part of the inclusive mindsets from our sports programs, which is the foundation of the movement, but then also our health and leadership and education programs, where this inclusive mindset kind of fills all of the programs that our movement provides. And so we, as you said, we now have very clear, teachable programs with this brief, with this inclusive mindset, and that that you are refining the work, and that the next generation of programming curriculum, and that I believe in. We'll dive more into this, but how our Special Olympics movement is really leading the way in inclusive education. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that. We're going to go ahead and take a quick break to let all of you listeners know how you can support this podcast. And when we come back, we will dive into the first pillar of universal dignity with Dr. Jackie Jodo, Chief of Youth and Education at Special Olympics. We'll be back after the short break on specialchronicles.com. Support for Special Chronicles comes from listeners like you. As an independent public media podcast, Special Chronicles will always be there for you. Now we're asking you to be there for us. As a nonprofit independent media organization, we can only make programs like Special Chronicles with listener support. Our programs provide weekly, candid, honest, and inspiring conversations about the people with disabilities community that creates awareness, support, and advocacy within each week's episode. Listeners tell us our shows are an enjoyable and necessary podcast for the intellectual and developmental disability community and everyone else who is able to listen to stories about life from a different angle. Please, if you and your family love our weekly podcasts, make a one-time, monthly, or annual gift of thanks today. Support this podcast at specialchronicles.com/give. That's specialchronicles.com/give. And we're back. Our guest is Dr. Jackie Jodo, Chief of Youth and Education at Special Olympics. And Jackie, as we dive into this first pillar, I just want to, I guess as a kind of a programming note, we have about 30 minutes left in this episode, so we'll probably have to kind of, and we've got a couple breaks to take as well, but we'll have to probably condense some of these talking points for these pillars into 30 minutes. But the second pillar on universal dignity, you had talked about how it begins with the notion of that these pillars begin with this notion of universal dignity, and how this dignity you had in our pre-show planning, you had told me that how it relates to social the transition life skills that a lot of us with intellectual disabilities go through in high school and into kind of post high school, and how this creates one of the things that you highlighted on the pillow, and that we'll briefly put up on the screen for our viewers, that it creates and participate that universal dignity create and creates and participates in opportunities to interact with a broad range of identities. Can you tell us briefly about this post, Carol?
Yeah, so it's the easiest way, I think, to really understand the framework is to start with the first two pillars, the universal dignity and the empathy and perspective taking. And I've already had given a brief introduction to each of those, but just to reiterate, what universal dignity really touches upon is recognizing that everyone is worthy of respect and that everyone has value regardless of their personal beliefs or their identity or their circumstances. And so it really involves an understanding of the fundamental rights accorded to all human beings, really a belief in the intrinsic worth of others. And you can see that given those values, that it really has a lot to do with justice and protecting the rights of other people, of others. And really it often involves protecting the rights of those who are most marginalized in our society. And as we know, one of the groups that is one of the most at risk and marginalized is those with intellectual difference. So universal dignity is just the foundational piece of an inclusive mindset. And then part of that is to shift into what we talk about in terms of, these competencies of empathy and perspective taking. And what's so interesting about empathy is everyone thinks that some people are empathetic, meaning they're sensitive to the thoughts and the views and the feelings of another. But that it's just kind of something that you're kind of born with or not born with. And what we know from the brain, as I mentioned, the brain science and learning science work, is that empathy is a teachable skill. You can teach young people, you can teach old people how to be empathetic if they're open to developing this skill and they're given the right tools and experiences to develop. And very closely related to empathy is this skill that we call perspective taking. And what perspective taking is being able to stand in the shoes of another. So you can be empathetic and understand and respect the views of another, but to be able to stand in their shoes and understand why they think what they think, even though you don't agree with it, is absolutely essential to an inclusive mindset. So the value of universal dignity and the skill of empathy and the skill of being able to take the perspective of others are the most essential elements to an inclusive mindset. And then finally, that last pillar, again, is walking the talk. And what we assume, and this really is a reflection of one's character. Are you willing to stand up for someone in a situation and act when it requires, acting outside of your comfort zone and really what we would call maybe violating a social norm in whatever setting you're in, kind of going in the face of what's accepted and what's cool and actually saying, okay, I'm going to intervene and stand up for this person who is being, potentially, maybe verbally discriminated against, maybe, socially excluded, maybe even physically, hurt. I mean, there's all sorts of terrible ways that people are marginalized. But what courageous action represents is this character trait of say, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to become an advocate, not only an advocate for those who are being marginalized, but I'm going to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and defend them in the face of that exclusion. And actually, what we see in the work of Special Olympics that the inclusive mindsets and behavior framework really starts to extend into relationships and friendships across difference. So those are the three components of the framework that absolutely allowed us to define it, and then allowed us to identify the core elements of it. And the whole reason for doing that is because we knew, as you said, Daniel, right when we started this, that we wanted to apply it to all the Special Olympics programming, whether it's our sports programming, whether it's education programming, whether it's our health or our leadership programming. So let me pause there.
Awesome. Well, for the sake of time, I want to say that I love the second pillar on how it's empathy and perspective taken, and something that Tim the Shriver had tweeted back a few years ago when the four of us original athletes that work at United Airlines, he had used, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he had used the term includers and how to be like the includers and not the excluders. And so I love how you kind of use the kind of this term of includers in this framework of inclusive mindsets, and then as a way of teaching this universal learning. We don't have time to kind of get into a lot of examples, but a couple examples is with the Unified Champion Schools, and that I'm going to put a link in the show notes to a 3-part podcast series that we did, walking our listeners through everything related to Unified Champion Schools. So if our listeners want to learn more about the Unified Champion Schools, they can click the link in the show notes to listen to that podcast that we did. And then an example is a newly released Champions movie that just came out with Woody Harrelson. And just briefly, I did a 10-minute review on the movie when I saw it 2 days before it came out in theaters. And Woody Harrelson's character teaches the Special Olympics athletes in the movie a lesson that people with ID are brave for what society puts on us, and lessons that they are champions no matter if they win or lose in the game and in life. So I don't, if you want to, and then the other example is...
That's a great example of courageous action, right? I mean, it's a great example of courageous action that, we don't want to give away the movie, but by the end of the movie, he starts to walk the talk. And you can see the journey for Woody Harrelson's, character in the movie as he starts to shape his own mindset as he gains more and more experiences with those with ID. I want to touch on your Tim's language, Dr. Shriver's language, includers, which I love. What's so important about the inclusive mindsets and behavior framework is that many of the diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks that are out there, what they really tend to do is create fear and shame among the includers. The includers are those who, in the case of Special Olympics, are without intellectual differences and are choosing to include those with intellectual differences. So often what we see is DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, that create this fear and shame among the includers. And as a result, it ends up creating more division than it's intended to do. What Special Olympics has done by bringing together those with and without ID is we've created these incredible experiences where you have, because they are shared experiences. They are shared experiences where we give young people the opportunity to get to know each other and to play on a soccer field, a football field, or a basketball court, and get to know each other, and really in the pursuit of the whatever the game or whatever the sporting event is, and then really start to really think more about what they have in common and very little about what they don't share. And so I think this is one of the most important things to understand about this framework, is that we create not fear and division, but we create acceptance and inclusion And it goes well beyond tolerance of difference. It goes on to acceptance and even embracing difference.
Yeah, awesome. Another two quick examples before we move into our final sponsor break, and that in the final segment to wrap up this this episode, our time together, is one example from when I was in my school years. I was bullied in school from peers not understanding me, and a few classmates had stood up for me. And then another example, if you kind of fast forward in my story to this podcast and this podcast platform on specialchronicles.com, is that, and I've heard from many listeners with disabilities, from other listeners with intellectual disabilities to physical disabilities, that Special Chronicles creates community for people with and without disabilities to understand our strengths and living experiences. Like I've heard from so many listeners that with the disability that they are diagnosed with, they feel alone. But when they listen to this podcast, they feel a sense of community. I think that relates to this framework that you talked about with inclusive mindsets. Oh, you muted.
Your wonderful example of how, your friends from Best Buddies, another advocacy group or youth group for those with ID, is they stood up for you. They exercised courageous action. And they also, had inclusive mindsets, I can guarantee you, because in their experiences with Best Buddies, they created, an understanding of those with ID and an understanding that, they were an understanding of the fact that you have to empathize as well as take the perspective of those with IDs to really understand their lived experiences. And I also can guarantee you that they believe in the value of universal dignity, that regardless of difference, all humanity should be valued for their contributions, regardless of difference.
Awesome. And to wrap up this segment, you had in a pre-show plan, and you had shared an example with me that I'm wondering if you could briefly share from your childhood of you interacting with a person who was blind, and then also kind of related to you growing up with metal braces and how that relates to understanding all differences, and whether it's someone who's blind, whether it's somebody with braces, whether it's somebody like myself and the 6 million athletes globally with intellectual disabilities. Can you kind of briefly share with us your example from your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. As a young person, I had a physical disability, which I continue to have as an adult. But as a young person, I had, if you can think of the movie Forrest Gump and the braces that he had as a child, and so I had those braces on for a couple of years and wasn't able to walk. And in those days, we didn't have services for children with disabilities, whether it was, a physical one like I had, or my friend Gwen Sarfolian, who was not sighted, or those with intellectual differences. We really didn't have any services. So we used to not there wasn't a bus, but so the school district put us in a cab to get us to and from school every day, because that was just part of what they did. And so Gwen and I got to know each other, and we would sit in the cab. And finally, one day, she asked me, if she could touch my face and if she could touch my legs where I had the braces, because she wanted to understand my difference. She wanted to understand why I was in the cab with her, because she knew that I was sighted. So I said, okay. I was just like a little kid, like 8, 9 years old. I said, sure. And so she felt all the different braces and screws and metal and, the shoes and everything. And then she felt my face to kind of put that all together. And from there, she had a lot of empathy for my own difference. And of course, I had, I learned, during these many car rides to and from school, what it was like when I'd shut my eyes and she'd tell me what it was like to not be sighted. And so that created, my empathy for her difference, and it allowed me to develop the skill of perspective taking of what it would be like to be not sighted, and similarly for Gwen. So when we were in school together, fortunately, I was in a situation where I didn't really experience bullying because the school was so supportive of our differences, and it was a smaller school with lots of involvement with the teachers and administrators. So we were some of the lucky ones.
Awesome. Well, we're going to go and take one final break. It will be about a 2 or 3 minute break. When we come back, we will wrap up this episode with some final thoughts as we wrap up this episode. Our guest is Dr. Jackie Jodl, Chief of Global Youth and Education at Special Olympics, and we will be back to wrap up this conversation right here on SpecialChronicles.com. Support for Special Chronicles comes from ComEd. Special Chronicles is proud to partner with the ComEd Energy Force Ambassador Program. The Energy Force is the country's first energy efficiency education program designed for and taught by people with disabilities. ComEd is powering lives, and Wary is powering us here at Special Chronicles to keep the lights on and our technology is powered on. As ComEd powers the lives of us, they are literally giving a voice to people with special needs. We thank ComEd for the generous support of our mission at Special Chronicles. Learn more at specialchronicles.com/ComEd. That's specialchronicles.com/ComEd. Support for Special Chronicles comes from United Airlines Bridge Disability Business Resource Group. Special Chronicles is proud to partner with United Airlines and the Bridge BLG. Bridge BLG is committed to being an ally for all employees and customers with disabilities. Bridge helps to create internal awareness to keep accessibility needs in mind and partner with key organizations to empower disability inclusion for employment and travel. Bridge, connecting people of all abilities. Book your travel today on United.com or on the award-winning United app. Learn more on United's commitment to disability inclusion for employment and travel at specialchronicles.com/United. That's specialchronicles.com/United. Special Chronicles is hosted by Podbean Podcast Hosting, the easiest, most affordable option to get started in podcasting. At Special Chronicles, we proudly host our weekly podcast with Podbean and highly recommend you use Podbean Podcast Hosting to get started in podcasting today. Sign up for an unlimited hosting plan and get 1 month free now to get started in podcasting today when you visit specialchronicles.com/Podbean. That's specialchronicles.com/Podbean. Our live streams are powered by StreamYard, the easiest way to create professional live streams. StreamYard is a live streaming studio in your browser. Interview guests, share your screen, and much more. Stream directly to your Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and other platforms. Sign up for StreamYard today using our StreamYard referral link when you visit specialchronicles.com/StreamYard. That's specialchronicles.com/StreamYard. And we're back to conclude this episode. I guess it's Dr. Jackie Jodl, Chief of Global Youth and Education at Special Olympics. And Jackie, before we get to the call to action, but before we get to some final thoughts, you want to share with us some social media plugs on how our listeners, if you're just listening to the audio podcast, we'll put links in the show notes, but go check out the live stream, the full video episode on our YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, links on specialchronicles.com to watch the full video episode. But do you want to let us know on what people can learn more about Special Olympics Unified Champion Schools and the education work?
Yeah, so I encourage everyone, you can definitely go to my LinkedIn profile, which is Jacqueline/Jodel. So it's linkedin.com/Jacqueline-Jodel, JL is the spelling of the last name. And see that this brief is on my website. You can also just Google Special Olympics Youth and Education, and you'll come up to our website and enter our website, and which is part of the Special Olympics website, and you'll see this brief will be featured as well, and you'll be able to learn more about Unified Champion Schools as well as our youth leadership work, and then of course our Center for Inclusion in Abu Dhabi.
Awesome. And before we get to that final question, do you have any final thoughts on your overall time? This is your second time on this podcast, but do you have any final thoughts on your overall time today on the Special Chronicles show?
Absolutely. I think that the final thought is that the whole reason for us to do this at Special Olympics is the next step, which we're going to be doing during the next 2 years, and that is applying the framework to all of our curriculum, all of our programming across the world. So we can be very intentional about teaching inclusive mindsets and behaviors because we know we have the experiences as part of Special Olympics programming, but we're going to be a little bit more thoughtful about providing the knowledge and the skills for all of our athletes and all of our other volunteers within the Special Olympics movement.
Awesome.
And then, yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, I was just going to say, so it seems like, and I guess what I've gained as the host of this podcast from talking with you today, and that I'm sure our listeners will as well, is that when we talk about inclusive mindsets, and that our listeners will, and everyone in our movement will know that we're not just talking about our education work, even though you're leading the education work, but also I don't know if our listeners viewers can see, I'm wearing an athlete leadership polo, and so it goes beyond education.
Across the Special Olympics footprint, absolutely. And we hope that other organizations that are committed to inclusion, whether it would be any organization to support youth development, whether it's associated with intellectual differences or not, all youth development organizations embrace this framework as a way to teach young people about how to include and how to develop mindsets that just automatically default to inclusion, not exclusion.
Awesome. And so to introduce this final question that we all kind of tweaking to kind of conclude with a call to action that we want to let all of you listeners to kind of not just take in this educational inclusive mindsets information that Jackie has shared with all of you listeners, but we really want to leave you with a call to action to go out into your community, go out into your schools and your workplaces to kind of build upon this inclusive mindsets. So to introduce our final question, let's go ahead and roll that bumper.
We're not just athletes.
We are the ambassadors of an uprising, peaceful protesters
In a rebellion against anyone
who has a fear of difference. Our demands are
equality,
dignity,
and the recognition of our
shared humanity.
We will not stop
Or accept anything less.
Today, our world is
More divided than ever.
and coming together has never been more urgent.
The revolution is inclusion. Find out more at jointherevolution.org.
So, Jackie, as this kind of final question came about that I've been concluding all of these podcast episodes with for the past 5 years, is I started asking this question about defining inclusion ever since I attended the 2019 World Games in Abu Dhabi, which it makes this episode kind of come full circle, because that's kind of how we kickstarted this at the top of the hour. But to kind of introduce this call to action, that we want to leave our listeners with is that I'm sure many of our listeners have inclusive mindsets. I know in even some of our very early listeners, they might not have had an inclusive mindset, but their perspective changed by listening to this podcast. And so I'm sure as we start to use this language of inclusive mindsets and defining it and linking it to inclusive behaviors, and really encouraging that this universal dignity and human relationships meaning for us, for our listeners to really walk the talk that people are wired to learn. So the question of the day and the question that we're going to leave our listeners with, and I'll let you kind of share our call to action, but the question of the day is, do you have an inclusive mindset? You're going to want to share with our listeners this call to action?
Yeah, absolutely. So I challenge all of us listening here today to reflect on oneself and ask, do I have an inclusive mindset? Do I believe in the universal dignity of all? Am I able to empathize with those who have differences from myself? Am I able to take the perspective of those who have differences from myself? And finally, am I able to take those two things, universal dignity and empathy and perspective taking, and am I able to stand up and demonstrate courageous action for those who are being marginalized? I suspect most of our listeners can say yes. And this podcast is one of the important tools that we have out there to help build mindsets, to help build an understanding of what's involved in a mindset, to give us the tools to demonstrate that courageous action. So the final twist of that question is, what about those in your immediate circle that probably need a little bit of help thinking about their mindsets and how they could be developing a more inclusive mindset? So I challenge you to go out there and be an inclusive mindset teacher, and understanding, taking these three pillars and bringing it to others, who are in our world, in our lived experiences, so we can start to spread and scale inclusive mindsets.
Awesome. Well, that's a perfect way to wrap up this episode. And I want to remind our listeners, specialchronicles.com for the show notes for this episode 521, and to follow Special Chronicles on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. Remember to follow, to hit that follow button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And we'll be back next week, and every Monday, 6 p.m. Central Time, for a new episode of the Special Chronicles show. Thank you, Jackie, for coming on the Special Chronicles show.
Thank you, Daniel. I was honored. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Embrace an inclusive mindset.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Special Chronicles podcast. Our podcast was produced by Daniel Smukowski on the Special Chronicles Network. Follow Special Chronicles on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Subscribe, rate, and review Special Chronicles on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our website, specialchronicles.com, where you can stream our archives of over 500 episodes for free. Also, there's a list of our favorites, original series, award-winning columns, and blogs. And sign up for our newsletter to receive exclusive bonus content delivered to your inbox. Again, specialchronicles.com. Special Chronicles is hosted by Podbean Podcast Hosting. Our live streams are powered by StreamYard. Thanks, as always, to our business manager, Adam Smukowski, who always encourages us to never give up. I'm Daniel Smukowski, back next week with more stories.
Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.